So let's get into the first one, the plan, the how. It establishes the method, right? Again, the how by which the scope will be created and managed. And there it goes, how project success will be validated. Validated. Well, you guys you don't have copies of PMBOK, all of you. Oh, I'm asking. Does anybody not have a copy of a PMBOK or an electronic version?
I do not have a copy of the current version. I have an older one.
Oh, you have an older one. Okay, the older one will still work. The older one will sort of still work for what I want to say here. So if you look in the monitoring controlling process group and you go to the scope area, you will see that the process, and there's two in there. There's control scope and validate scope. And the only person that can validate scope is who?
Sponsor?
The sponsor. The sponsor and only the sponsor. Okay? The sponsor and only the sponsor. The sponsor signs the charter, the sponsor validates scope. So here's where we come up with the plan for how the sponsor is going to tell us if they accept our work or not. And this is really important. And this is something that I'm not going to say gets missed, but it's not a common practice that I see in project managers. It's not common for people to think about how we're going to be sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? I think you get it. How they're going to test us, but it's not the word I want to say, but it's just that idea. So we're going to create this plan and we're going to come up with it. So you got predictive versus adaptive or agile. We got to consider that here as well. You know, do we kind of know what we're doing and this has happened before, or are we treading uncharted waters? And that's also going to have an impact on how you're going to want to have your work be judged. So predictive projects typically have lower expected levels of change because if you've done this multiple times, you should be able to, you know, reproduce that. And then agile projects typically have high expected levels of change or adaptability, if you will. Either way, all the necessary work required to complete that project needs to be in there, or that phase at the very least. At the very least, that phase, right? Everything you need to do needs to be in the scope.
CJ, this is Mike Sam.
Yes.
A question. So validating the scope. So we had the verified deliverables. Now we're going to validate those deliverables. Mm-hmm. Did I hear right? You guys said it's the sponsor who validates the deliverables?
Yes. So
so I have a question on that. So I thought it was the customer who walks through and validates those deliverables. Or are we using customer and sponsor interchangeably? Because in the PMBOK, it says the customer validates deliverables.
Yes. Yes, and yes. So PMI will use sponsor, customer, client, any other term, but any other term to say this is the person that that authorized, you know, that is paying for this project and has given you your authority to be the project manager. They're the person who's going to sign off on, and so that's blanket, right? Because in a practical application of this, many times sponsors will assign someone else to validate portions of the work because they will actually be the end user, right? But those people will then report back up to that person and say, yes, we approve. And then the sponsor will, you know, sort of formally approve at that point. So for the exam, the sponsor and only the sponsor can validate scope, but they may use the word client or customer and it is interchangeable.
Okay, thanks.
Just not key stakeholders. Key stakeholders cannot validate scope. I should say it that way. It has to be a client customer response.
Yeah, that probably makes better. That's probably something you'll see on the test like that. Exactly. Thanks.
All right, so we see our inputs. We have the charter. Obviously, we're going to take that in. We've got the plan. We're going to take quality management plan, the lifestyle description, and development approach. We haven't done the quality management plan yet. We haven't gotten there. So again, just another example. We're iterating. We are iterating here. ES, OPAs, expert judgment, analyze some data, and then we're going to have some meetings. The output, we get two from here. We get a scope management plan and we get a requirements management plan. And let me talk about that. This is the idea that there are some projects that create products, and then there's some projects that don't, right? There's only two types of projects, ones that either create something or ones that don't. If your project doesn't, it's more of a service, or, you know, it could be, let's say I'm going to upgrade an email server, you know, or we're going to relocate our offices. Okay, well then, you know, that's your standard project. But if you're going to build a product, that product can only be measured by its requirements. So we need a requirements management plan. But the scope of a project will always be larger than the product itself, right? So if we have a product, which is a phone, well, then the scope of that will be larger because there's going to be a level of testing and documentation and training for this product. And so we can measure the size of a project by its project management plan. We can measure the size of a product by its requirements, right? So just remember that. We measure the scope of a project against the plan. We measure the scope of a product against its requirements. And, you know, then therefore we get these two plans. And you'll see it on the exam, so note that. I'll say it one more time. We measure the scope of a project against its plan. We measure the scope of a product against its requirements. And the key output here, again, the two, let's talk about those, is the scope management plan. Right? Scope management plan gives us the how we're going to define it, how we're going to develop it, how we're going to monitor it, and how we're going to control it. All right, it's a how. You kind of see, here's a scope management plan, you know, sort of a template that you can see there. But this could be a Word document. It could literally just say, you know, what's the process? Think of it like this. Ask yourselves this question right now. You know, and I see Ryan and Maggie, you guys are off mute, so I'll just ask you. How do you create your scope statements?
Boy, that's a big question, CJ. Oftentimes, the types of services that our clients are asking for, we have some collateral that we can use internally, you know, OPAs that we start with, and then we tailor it to specific needs or specific things that they've told us. Mm-hmm. I think as long as we've been doing this kind of work, I find that it's pretty rare where I'm creating a scope from scratch because it's so new and different from anything we've ever done. So I always start with something that we've already delivered successfully and modify that to tailor it to the specific needs of the client.
Okay. This is being, and hold on, Maggie, this is being recorded, by the way, Ryan. So if I could, you know, I should tell you guys that if you didn't know, like, these things are being recorded, these ones, you know, so don't say anything illegal. No, it's not being used for anything except our internal purposes. But the reason why I said that is because if I could then take that audio transcription of what you just said, that's your scope management plan.
Okay.
All right. So Maggie, how do you get your scope statement developed?
So ours is kind of the polar opposite, where almost every project is slightly different. So the scope is really determined by what in product or service the client wants. So we've had clients come up to us basically saying, we want you to create X document that has never existed before. So then we have to go back through and say, okay, to get to X document, this is the type of work we would need to do, and trying to like negotiate with them of what is a reasonable scope for how much they have budgeted, because we tend to work with state and local governments.
Okay. Now, as you're going through, and if the scope needs to change, how do you go about doing that?
Usually it's a conversation with the sponsor of what are their priorities in the scope changing, because we're usually constrained by budget.
Okay. And then how do you get sign off?
So it'd be with agreement between the project sponsors, usually a client, our internal management, and then sometimes even we have a separate contracting office. So they might have other requirements if we have to change scope too much.
Okay. So my name is Maggie Davis, and I'm a project manager. And I get my scope defined by my client's requirements. They will tell me how they want us to develop the scope statement, and this is how we'll do it. This is how we'll develop it. We monitor scope by and control it because it's cost driven. So we will have conversations with the client. We're not going to send any emails back and forth or any faxes. We're just going to have a very open conversation and understand it. And when it's done, our contracting offices will go back and make sure that all of the requirements were met and that everything is good. And then, you know, they'll work with the sponsor for transfer of funds or something like that. I don't know. That's kind of what I'm hearing, right? That would be, okay, that's your scope management plan. So you would write it. This is how we're going to do it. So that's all of these plans, that we're going to go through from now on. That's what they really mean. And do you see how there's nothing specific about your project in there? And you can use that plan probably over and over again, and you'll slightly tweak it for each project. But now you have a scope management plan that you can use forever. And that's the idea. All right. So that's the idea from PMI, at least when you create these things, is that then they do become OPAs. And then you can use them over and over, but that's what the goal here. So we're not talking about the specific scope of the project. We're talking about how to do it, in general terms. Does that make sense? Okay. Now the requirements management plan, slightly different, right? Because we talked about scope, and many times, you know, scope and requirements are linked, so scope would sort of encapsulate it. You know, but now if we're going to dial in on just requirements, we got to talk about how we're going to analyze, document, and manage those things. So, you know, there could be a business analysis plan. There's many different terms. You know, in software development, this is huge. In product development, it's huge too. You know, having all of your requirements. So it's, you know, it's literally and you'll see the traceability matrix when we get through. Right. This is a document that helps make sure that you don't. Anybody using a traceability matrix? Show of hands? No. Okay. You might be. You're just probably using it in a different term, I imagine. You know, just like how many of you have a scope management plan? Okay, you have one. So that's so when you create these things, what I want you all to do, because we have a week between each of these, and so create one, and when we come back next week, you know, now you'll have one, and not only is it going to help you for the exam, but now you've got something in your arsenal that's, you know, practical and you can use. All right. So
I would just say in my company, we use maybe not so much a requirements management plan, but we have what is called a BRD. It's the same thing. BRD kind of goes through, lists basically everything, has the requirements, also has kind of a matrix that traces where these requirements go to. Mm-hmm. We call it a BRD. I don't know if that's kind of a common nomenclature throughout the industry.
And what does that stand for, Michael?
This is business requirement documentation. Okay. Now, it's very, very important. So we go through kind of what you guys just described as far as the scope, and you know, you're getting through all that stuff, defining the scope statement, working with the business, etc. We give that BRD. Once we kind of get to where we think we're at, we'll take that BRD, we give it to the technology team. They go through their analysis. Is this feasible, or are we asking for something that just can't be done? And then once we get that analysis done, that takes a couple of days. Then I bring it back to the business, and I have the business sit and we validate it with the business sponsor, with the customer, the business, however you want to call that. And then that's it. That requirement those requirements cannot be changed unless they go through a change control type process. And I have found, again, I kind of came back to seeing some of the projects fail where I'm at, and it was because they didn't get that blessing, that single validation we call a gate, you know, that they went through to ensure that those requirements are validated and the business, you know, clear success, all that good stuff is measured on that business requirement documentation. So
here's what's awesome about that is that's actually an output. We're going to see that in the next process. We're going to see that those documents are actually outputs. You know, but what's interesting here is that you just described how at your company you all define and develop your scope. So you gave me that portion right there. You just, as I'm hearing you talk, I just heard you tell me how you do those. So I mean, it sounds like we all get it now. So this is good. We get the how part. because it's important. So now that we move forward, you can kind of blow through these plans, if you will, because you're going to get that it's a how, and we can focus on the nomenclature that you need for the exam. But the key part for the application for you to actually use it successfully in your projects is understanding that these are hows. This is how you're going to do stuff. So that's good. So we got one for scope. We got one for requirements. All right. So we just talked about how we develop it. So going through, you're going to use a charter. You're going to use portions of your project management plan, or maybe all of it. And then your OPAs. As Ryan was saying, is, hey, you know, the way we develop it is we typically take a template from something that's there. We don't create stuff from scratch, right? That will be your OPA. All right. So those are the inputs. Use your tools and techniques as the expert judgment. You as a PM will determine when you want to leverage templates versus when you want to make something brand new, or when you need to go and really, you know, get the ear and the voice of the customer versus when you sort of consult for them. And then you're going to analyze all the different alternative methods that you could do it, all right? Different ways of validating the scope with the client or the customer or the sponsor, different ways of creating it. You know, that's what I was hearing earlier too. If you send it back to a technology team, they tell you if it's feasible because they're going to analyze it that way too. So they're going to help you, you know, so that's part of the whole how, you know, how we develop this thing.